Think about the last time something happened that you couldn't control. Maybe it was a person, someone who let you down, someone who criticized you unfairly, someone who simply didn't behave the way you needed them to. Maybe it was a situation, a plan that collapsed, a project that failed, a door that closed when you were certain it would open. Maybe it was smaller than that, traffic that made you late, a comment that stuck in your head for hours, a morning that went wrong and poisoned the rest of your day. We live in a world that is almost completely outside our control. The weather, the economy, other people's opinions, illness, loss, the passage of time, none of it bends to our will. And yet most of us spend enormous amounts of mental and emotional energy trying to manage things we cannot manage, worrying about outcomes we cannot determine, and feeling frustrated, anxious, or angry when the world refuses to cooperate with our expectations. This is perhaps the oldest human struggle of all, not poverty, not war, not failure, but the struggle to stay calm and clear-headed inside a world that is chaotic, unpredictable, and often deeply unfair. We react when we should respond. We say things we don't mean when we are tired or provoked. We give our peace of mind away to people and events that haven't earned it. We carry yesterday's anger into today. We lose sleep over things that have not yet happened and may never happen. We know, intellectually, that most of what we worry about doesn't matter, and yet we worry anyway. If any of that feels familiar, you are not broken. You are human, and you are in very good company because the man I want to tell you about today wrestled with exactly these same battles, every single day. His name was Marcus Aurelius. He was the emperor of Rome. He commanded the most powerful empire the Western world had ever seen. He had wealth, status, and authority beyond anything most people can imagine. And every morning before he faced his day, he sat down in private and wrote notes to himself. Reminders to stay calm, to be patient, to control his reactions, to be kind, to remember what was truly within his power and what was not. He never intended those notes to be published. He never intended anyone to read them at all. They were his private struggle with himself, and they are some of the most powerful words ever written about how to live with dignity inside a world you cannot control. Marcus Aurelius was born on April 26, 121 AD in Rome. His family was wealthy and well-connected, but Marcus lost his father at a very young age, and he was raised primarily by his grandfather. From his earliest years, he was drawn not to power and luxury, but to philosophy, to the question of how a person ought to live. He was a serious, studious, unusually thoughtful child. While other young Roman aristocrats pursued gladiatorial spectacle and political ambition, Marcus was quietly reading, thinking, and learning from every teacher he could find. He adopted the lifestyle of a philosopher before he was a teenager, sleeping on a hard bed, wearing a simple cloak, waking early, practicing self-discipline not because anyone forced him to, but because he genuinely believed that the quality of a life depended on the quality of the mind directing it. When he was about 17, something changed his trajectory completely. The Emperor Hadrian, one of Rome's greatest rulers, had no natural heir. He chose a man named Antoninus Pius to succeed him, but on one condition, that Antoninus adopt Marcus Aurelius and groom him for eventual leadership. And so, without seeking it, without campaigning for it, the quiet philosopher boy was placed on a path that would lead him to the throne of the most powerful civilization on earth. He spent nearly 20 years as heir, learning the mechanics of empire, watching and studying, still reading, still writing, still practicing philosophy. And in 161 AD, at the age of 40, Marcus Aurelius became emperor of Rome. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength, Marcus said. And then the hardest part of his story begins, because what followed was not triumph and glory. What followed was almost unrelenting hardship. Within the first year of his reign, a pandemic known today as the Antonine Plague swept across the Roman Empire. It is estimated to have killed between 5 and 10 million people. Entire villages were emptied. The Roman army, the backbone of imperial security, was devastated. Marcus organized relief efforts, sent physicians, ordered public health measures, and personally managed the crisis for years. He could not stop the plague. He could only manage it, as wisely and as humanely as he could, for as long as it lasted. At the same time, the borders of the empire came under attack. Germanic tribes crossed the Danube in the north. Conflicts erupted in the east. Marcus, who was a philosopher, not a soldier by temperament, was forced to become a military commander. He spent the majority of his reign not in Rome, not in comfort, but on campaign along the frontier, living in a tent, managing armies, making life-and-death decisions under conditions of exhaustion and extreme pressure. He was away from home for years at a stretch. He disliked war. He found it brutal and wasteful, and he fought it anyway because it was what his people needed of him. His personal life was no easier. He and his wife Faustina had 14 children, and only 6 survived to adulthood. He buried child after child. He watched people he loved die from the plague that was killing his empire. He suffered his own health problems throughout his life: digestive illness, chest pain, sleeplessness. He was never a physically robust man, and yet he carried the weight of an empire for 19 years without complaint. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way, he said. And through all of it, the plague, the wars, the grief, the exhaustion, he kept writing. Every night or in stolen moments between military dispatches, he opened his private journal and he talked to himself. Not about strategy, not about politics, about how to be a better person, about patience, about not being ruled by anger, about remembering that the men who frustrated him were human beings just like him, doing their best with what they had. About the shortness of life and the importance of not wasting a single day in bitterness. Those writings, which we now call the Meditations, were never polished for publication. They are rough, repetitive, urgent, the private notes of a man actively struggling to live up to his own values. They are remarkable not because Marcus Aurelius had it all figured out, but because they show us that he didn't. He had to remind himself over and over of the same truths. He slipped. He got angry. He despaired. And every time he came back to his principles. His philosophy was rooted in Stoicism, a school of thought founded centuries earlier in Greece that had become Rome's dominant philosophy by his time. And the core of Stoicism is a single, transformative idea. The only thing you truly own is your own mind. Everything outside it, your reputation, your health, your wealth, other people's behavior, even your own life, is ultimately not in your control. But your response to events, your judgments, your values, your inner attitude, these are always yours. No one can take them from you. Marcus built his entire life around this idea, and he tested it in conditions that would have broken most people. Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be one, he said once. His principles, drawn from both his writing and his life, are worth dwelling on. The first was the dichotomy of control. Every morning, Marcus reminded himself to sort the day's challenges into 2 categories: things within his control and things outside it. His own thoughts, his own actions, his own effort, his own values, these were his. The plague, the weather, the behavior of his generals, the decisions of foreign kings, these were not. He invested his energy accordingly, refusing to be tormented by what he could not change, and refusing to neglect what he could. The second was radical self-examination. Marcus was harder on himself than on anyone around him. The Meditations are full of self-criticism, notes where he catches himself being vain, impatient, or distracted, and calls himself back. He did not believe he was a naturally virtuous man. He believed virtue was something you practiced every day, and that the moment you stopped practicing, you began to lose it. He treated his character as a garden that required constant tending. The third was seeing difficulty as an opportunity. Marcus wrote again and again about the idea that obstacles are not the enemy of progress, they are the material of progress. When the plague came, it gave him the opportunity to show what compassionate leadership looked like. When war came, it gave him the opportunity to practice courage and endurance. He didn't celebrate hardship for its own sake, but he refused to be a victim of it. He asked, each time difficulty arrived, "What can I do with this? What does this require of me?" The fourth was kindness toward others. This is the part of Mucka's Aralaz that surprises people who expect Stoicism to be cold and detached. His meditations are full of instructions to himself to be patient with difficult people, to remember that they, too, have their struggles, their fears, their reasons. He was one of the most powerful men in the world, and he wrote private notes to himself reminding him not to feel superior, not to be harsh, not to forget that every human being, from the senator in Rome to the prisoner on the frontier, was deserving of dignity. When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. They are this way because they cannot tell good from evil. But I have seen the beauty of good and the ugliness of evil, and recognized that the wrongdoer has a nature related to my own, so none of them can hurt me, he declared. That passage is worth sitting with. Every single morning before dealing with difficult people, he reminded himself not to be surprised by them, not to be wounded by them, and not to become like them. He armored himself with understanding rather than resentment, and then he went out and led. His final years were spent back on the northern frontier, still fighting, still campaigning. His health was failing. He knew it. In 180 AD, at the age of 58, Mucka's Aralaz died at his military camp on the Danube. He had spent almost his entire reign managing crises he had not chosen and did not want. He had remained, by every historical account, one of the most just, self-controlled, and genuinely good men ever to hold absolute power. Edward Gibbon, the great historian, wrote that the period of Mucka's Aralaz's reign was the time in history when the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous. A man who disliked power, presiding over its best use. And he left behind a journal he never meant to publish, which has now been read by millions of people across nearly 2,000 years, in dozens of languages, on every continent on Earth. Not because it is polished or impressive, because it is honest, because it shows a human being at the peak of worldly power, struggling with the same inner battles you face right now. So what does a Roman emperor from the 2nd century have to do with your life today? A lot, because the battle Mucka's Aralaz fought every day was not fought in war tents or imperial courts. It was fought inside his own mind, in the space between what happened and how he chose to respond. And that is exactly where your most important battles are fought too. You cannot control what your colleagues say about you behind your back. You cannot control whether the project succeeds or fails. You cannot control whether the people you love stay healthy, whether the economy treats you fairly, whether the world recognizes your effort. You cannot control most of what happens to you. But you can control your response, always. In every situation, no matter how difficult, there is a version of you that chooses how to show up, that chooses patience over reaction, that chooses effort over complaint, that chooses to find what is useful in difficulty rather than being consumed by it. That version of you is always available. Mucka's Aralaz spent 19 years on the most stressful job in the world learning to access it and reminding himself every single day that it was there. Never esteem anything as of advantage to you that will make you break your word or lose your self-respect, said Mucka's. Self-control is not about suppression. It is not about pretending you don't feel anger or grief or fear. Mucka's Aralaz felt all of those things. He buried his children. He watched his empire suffer. He dealt with betrayal, with ingratitude, with people who abused his patience. He felt it all. Self-control is about what you do with those feelings, whether you let them make your decisions for you, or whether you pause, breathe, and choose deliberately. That pause, that tiny space between the stimulus and the response, is where your character lives. That is where Stoicism lies. Not in cold detachment, but in that deliberate breath before you speak, before you react, before you let someone else's worst moment become yours too. Think about the things that steal your peace most often, the driver who cuts you off, the person who doesn't respond to your message, the plan that falls apart at the last moment, the criticism that you can't stop replaying. Ask yourself honestly, how much of that is actually within your control? And how much energy, how much of your one and only life, are you spending on the part that isn't? Marcus Aurelius sat in a tent on the edge of the Roman Empire, surrounded by war and plague and grief, and he chose, deliberately, every morning, to focus only on what was his to manage. Not because everything else didn't matter, but because everything else was not his to carry. You don't need to be an emperor to practice this. You need only to begin. Begin small. Begin today. The next time something provokes you, take one breath before you respond. The next time you catch yourself worrying about something outside your control, name it, say to yourself, quietly, "This is not mine to carry." The next time a difficulty arrives, ask not why is this happening to me, but what does this require of me? That is how Marcus Aurelius lived. That is how a private, philosophically minded man who never wanted power became, in the judgment of history, one of the greatest leaders who ever lived. Not through brilliance alone, not through ruthlessness, but through the daily, unglamorous, deeply difficult practice of self-mastery. The meditations end not with a triumphant conclusion but with a quiet reminder to himself, and now, across 2,000 years to you. Confine yourself to the present. Not the past which cannot be changed, not the future which cannot be known. The present, this moment, this breath, this choice in front of you right now, that is where your power is. That is where it has always been. The Emperor of Rome reminded himself of this every morning. You can remind yourself too. Start now.